Welcome back to the archive. I'm glad you've returned. The candles are lit, the shelves are heavy with stories, and it's always good to have company here among them. If you've been enjoying these quiet journeys into folklore and forgotten history, I'd ask you to take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a small thing, but it helps keep the archive alive and lets these old tales continue to find their way into the world. Tonight, we open a page that nearly every culture has written upon. A story so old, it coils through the roots of civilization itself. Creatures vast enough to blot out the sky or curl unseen in the shadows of a cave. They breathe fire that can level kingdoms, summon storms that can sink fleets, and guard treasures no mortal was ever meant to touch. Some are crowned with wings, others are long and serpentine, flowing through the clouds like rivers of living lightning. Some lurk in caves with eyes like embers, while others circle the very edges of the world, their bodies endless. For as long as humans have told stories, there have been dragons, and they have never been just monsters. They are symbols of chaos, of power, of greed, of wisdom. Sometimes gods, sometimes devils, and sometimes something stranger still. To follow the trail of dragons is to follow the imagination of humankind itself. So, let us begin. To begin with dragons, we must step back into one of the oldest surviving stories humanity has ever written down. Long before medieval knights or fire-breathing beasts of fairy tales, there was Tiamat. In Mesopotamia, where rivers shaped the land and empires rose between the Tigris and the Euphrates, people told a creation story known as the Enuma Elish. And in this tale, the universe itself was born from water, fresh and salt mingling together. From those waters came Tiamat, the great chaos serpent, the mother of monsters. Tiamat was not the kind of dragon you picture perched on gold. She was more terrible, more immense, a primeval ocean given form. Her body was said to stretch out endlessly, her scales gleaming like night, her mouth wide enough to swallow God's whole. In some tablets, she is described as a serpent, in others as a great draconic beast with wings, horns, and claws. But always, she is chaos incarnate, raw, untamed, and terrifying. The story tells that Tiamat rose in anger when younger gods disturbed the order of things. She gathered an army of monsters, venomous dragons, fierce serpents, and creatures with scales and fangs no human had ever seen. Against her came Marduk, a storm god armed with a net, a bow, and an arrow forged to pierce the unpierceable. Their battle was nothing less than cosmic. Marduk's winds filled Tiamat's jaws, holding her open as he loosed his arrow deep into her heart. When she fell, he split her body in two. With one half, he made the sky. With the other, he formed the earth. The Chaos Dragon was slain, but from her body the ordered world was born. It is one of the earliest dragon stories we know, and already it carries the themes that follow dragons through history. Chaos versus order, terror versus creation, destruction feeding into life. In Tiamat, we see the beginning of a pattern that cultures across the world would repeat in their own way. For the people of Mesopotamia, the dragon was not just a monster. It was the universe itself, dangerous and eternal, waiting in the waters beneath all things. From Mesopotamia, we travel west into the desert lands of Egypt, where another serpent of chaos awaited. His name was Apophis, also called Apep, a monstrous snake who embodied darkness itself. Every night, the sun god Ra journeyed through the underworld on his solar bark, carrying the light that would rise again at dawn. And every night, Apophis rose from the depths to devour him. Apophis was not merely a snake, though that is how he was often shown. He was vast, coiled around the horizon, scales black as midnight. His jaws stretched open wide enough to swallow the sun. In some stories, he spat fire and poison. In others, he simply lurked, silent and endless, waiting to strike. What made Apophis terrifying was not that he always won, but that he never stopped. Each night he attacked Ra's ship. Each night the gods fought him off, and each night he returned. Priests would recite spells to aid Ra, stabbing wax figures of Apophis, burning them, cutting them apart. Yet no matter how often he was defeated, he returned with the next night. Unlike Tiamat, Apophis did not become the world. He remained outside it, pressing always against its edges, the threat of chaos swallowing order. He was the reminder that darkness is never gone, only held at bay for a time. And so, even in Egypt, we find the dragon as a cosmic opponent, endless, unkillable, always testing the strength of gods and humans alike. Moving east to the ancient lands of the Indus and later India, the image of the serpent dragon changes. Here, the Naga appears, not always a monster, but something far more complex. The word Naga means serpent, but Nagas were more than simple snakes. They were divine or semi-divine beings, often depicted as great cobras, sometimes with multiple heads, and sometimes as half-human, half-serpent. They lived in rivers, lakes, and underground palaces filled with jewels. Unlike Tiamat or Apophis, Nagas were not embodiments of chaos. They were guardians of water and fertility. A Naga might bring rain to nourish crops, or withhold it in anger. They could be protectors of treasure, or fierce defenders of sacred places. In Buddhist tradition, the Naga sometimes appear as allies. The Buddha himself was said to have been sheltered during meditation by the coils and hood of a great Naga who spread its body over him to shield him from a storm. Yet in Hindu stories, Nagas could also be dangerous, striking humans with floods or venom when disrespected. What makes the Naga remarkable is its balance. It was not simply good or evil, but a force of nature, powerful, unpredictable, demanding respect. Where in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the dragon was chaos opposed by the gods. In India, the serpent dragon was woven into the cycles of life itself. The Nagas remind us that not all dragons were born to be slain. Some were to be honored, appeased, and even revered. And so we arrive in China, where dragons take on one of their most enduring and recognizable forms. The Chinese long, or lung, is not a monster, but a symbol of power, prosperity, and balance. Earliest depictions of Chinese dragons appear on Neolithic pottery and jade carvings, winding serpent shapes with long bodies and stylized heads. Unlike the fire-breathing beasts of Europe, these dragons were associated with water and weather. They brought rain to nourish crops. They lived in rivers and seas, and they were linked to the authority of emperors. In Chinese thought, the dragon was a cosmic force. It embodied yang, active, vital, celestial energy. It rose with thunder and descended with rain. The emperor himself was often called the son of the dragon. His throne, the dragon throne, to rule with the mandate of heaven, was to rule under the dragon's symbol. Yet dragons in Chinese stories were not always gentle. They could be wrathful, bringing floods and storms. But their power was never senseless. They represented the might of nature itself, both its blessings and its dangers. With their long, serpentine bodies, antler-like horns, and whiskered faces, Chinese dragons became distinct from the winged, bat-like beasts of the West. They did not hoard treasure or demand sacrifice. Instead, they served as guardians, rulers, and bringers of order. Here, the dragon had shifted from chaos to harmony, from destruction to blessing. Finally, before the age of knights and castles, we return to Europe, where early myths already whispered of serpentine monsters, proto-dragons called worms. The word worm comes from Old English and Old Norse, meaning simply serpent or worm. But these were no earthworms. Worms were great snakes, often wingless, that slithered across the land or coiled in caves. They poisoned rivers, strangled livestock, and demanded tribute. In Norse and Germanic legend, such creatures already appear. The Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, encircles the world, destined to fight Thor at Ragnarok. Fafnir, once a dwarf, transformed into a dragon to guard his cursed hoard of gold. In Celtic stories, too, serpents and dragons appeared as forces to be conquered by heroes. What unites these worms is their role as challengers. They are obstacles to be overcome, embodiments of greed, destruction, or primal fear. They are not gods, like Tiamat, nor cosmic inevitabilities like Apophis. They are closer to the Western dragon we will meet later, deadly, hoarding, corrupting. These proto-dragons set the stage for what would become one of the most famous images in all of folklore, the fire-breathing beast of the Middle Ages. But even here, at their earliest, worms were already shaping the idea of what a dragon could be. Something vast, serpentine, and inhuman, set forever against humankind. The Greeks did not lack for monsters, and among them, dragon serpents lurked in the margins of their stories. Two, in particular, became famous: Python and Ladon. Python was said to be a great serpent that dwelled at Delphi, in a cave at the foot of Mount Parnassus. Some said he was born from the slime left behind after the great flood of Deucalion. Others said he was always there, an ancient guardian of the earth, his coils wrapped around the sacred spring, and his presence filled the air with dread. The god Apollo came upon him, bow in hand. Their battle was long remembered, the young god against the ancient serpent. In the end, Apollo slew Python and claimed the site as his own. Over time, Delphi became the home of his famous oracle, and the Pythian priestess took her very title from the serpent Apollo had slain. Even in death, Python shaped prophecy. Then there was Ladon. This dragon guarded the golden apples of the Hesperides, treasures hidden in a garden at the world's edge. Some said Ladon had 100 heads, each hissing in a different voice. Others imagined him as a vast serpent coiled eternally around the tree. His task was simple: keep the apples from mortals. Heracles, in his 11th labor, came to face Ladon. Whether he slew the dragon outright or merely tricked his way past depends on the telling. But always, Ladon represents the same idea: the serpent guardian, forever bound to treasure, forever an obstacle to the hero. For the Greeks, dragons were not random beasts. They were guardians of thresholds, between divine and mortal, between treasure and thief. And to defeat them was to claim not just wealth, but power and destiny. In the cold north, dragons were no less fierce. The sagas give us two unforgettable names: Fafnir and Jörmungandr. Fafnir's tale begins not as a dragon, but as a man, a dwarf, the son of Hreidmar. When a cursed treasure hoard fell into his hands, greed consumed him. Fafnir retreated into the wilderness, and there, corrupted by the gold, he transformed into a dragon, wingless, massive, breathing poison, guarding his hoard with a jealous fury. The hero Sigurd, guided by the trickster Regan, dug a pit along the path where Fafnir slithered. When the dragon passed overhead, Sigurd thrust his sword upward into Fafnir's belly. As the creature died, he spoke, warning the young hero that the curse of the treasure would claim him too. The tale of Fafnir is not simply about slaying a monster. It is about how greed transforms us, how obsession can turn man into beast. Jörmungandr, by contrast, was never human. Known as the Midgard serpent, he was the child of Loki and the giantess Angerboda. Cast into the sea by Odin, Jörmungandr grew until he encircled the entire world, biting his own tail. He lay beneath the waves, stirring storms with every movement. It was foretold that when Ragnarok came, Thor would face him. Their battle would be terrible. Thor would slay the serpent, but not before Jörmungandr's venom killed him in turn. Here, the dragon is apocalypse itself, coiled around the earth, waiting for the end of days. Together, Fafnir and Jörmungandr show two faces of Norse dragons, one born from greed, one both fatal. Across the Celtic world, dragons, draig in Welsh, took on a symbolic role, standing for power, prophecy, and even the fate of nations. In Wales, one story tells of two dragons locked in endless battle. The red dragon and the white dragon fought beneath the land, their roars shaking the earth, their struggles shattering walls. The red dragon, said to symbolize the Britons, eventually triumphed, while the white dragon represented invading Saxons. From this tale came the red dragon of Wales, still flying proudly on the national flag today. Celtic dragons were often tied to the land itself. They marked where power flowed, where ley lines crossed, where kings might rise or fall. To see a dragon in a dream was to glimpse destiny. To slay one was not just to conquer a beast, but to shift the balance of kingdoms. In Irish stories, too, serpent dragons appear, sometimes as obstacles to heroes, sometimes as foes tied to lakes and rivers. Always, they represented something vast and primal, as much a part of the land as the stones and rivers themselves. In these myths, dragons are no longer just monsters. They are symbols of sovereignty, of the struggle between peoples, of the heartbeat of the land itself. In India, the Naga tradition expanded into stories of cosmic struggle. The Nagas became kings of serpents, lords of treasure and water, while their great enemy was Garuda, the mighty bird, half man, half eagle, born to fight them. Garuda was enormous, with wings that stretched across the sky, feathers shining like fire. His mother had been enslaved by the serpents, and so he fought them endlessly, determined to free her. In Hindu myth, Garuda becomes the vehicle of the god Vishnu, soaring through the heavens, devouring snakes by the thousands. The image is striking, serpents and dragons as lords of earth and water, and Garuda as their heavenly foe. Together, they represent the balance of opposites, sky and ground, bird and serpent, gods and demons. Yet even in these tales, Nagas are not always villains. They remain guardians of hidden treasures, protectors of sacred rivers, powerful beings who could bless or curse. The conflict with Garuda reminds us that dragons, in India, were woven into a broader cosmic fabric. They were not outsiders, they were part of the balance of things. Crossing into Japan, dragons take on their own character, borrowing from China, but reshaped by Shinto and Buddhist thought. Japanese dragons, or Ryu, are long, serpentine beings, often wingless, with clawed feet and whiskered faces. Like their Chinese cousins, they are water spirits, dwelling in seas, rivers, and rainfall. They are connected to agriculture, prosperity, and the rhythm of nature. One famous tale is that of Ryujin, the Dragon King of the Sea. He lived in a palace beneath the waves, filled with coral and jewels, attended by fish and turtles. Heroes who visited him found both danger and blessing, for Ryujin could be generous but also wrathful. Another tale tells of Yamata no Orochi, an 8-headed dragon that terrorized the land. Each year it demanded a maiden as sacrifice. When the storm god Susanoo came upon it, he devised a trick. He brewed 8 vats of sake and placed them where Orochi would drink. The monster drank deeply, fell into a stupor, and Susanoo struck, cutting off its heads one by one. In the belly of the beast, he found a sword, Kusanagi, one of the 3 sacred treasures of Japan. Here again, dragons are both divine and destructive, lords of water, bringers of fertility, yet also foes to be conquered by cunning and courage. If there is one story that defined the Western image of the dragon, it is that of St. George. The tale has been told so many times, in so many places, that it feels like the archetype: the knight, the maiden, and the dragon. The legend tells of a city plagued by a monstrous dragon that demanded tribute. First, the townsfolk gave it sheep. When the sheep ran out, they gave it their children, chosen by lottery. One day, the king's own daughter was chosen. She was led out to the swamp where the dragon lived, waiting to be devoured. But St. George rode into the story, a Christian knight clad in armor, bearing a red cross upon his shield. He struck the dragon with his lance, wounding it, and then bound it with the princess's girdle as if it were a tame hound. Leading the beast back to the city, George slew it before the people and baptized them into the Christian faith. In this story, the dragon is not merely a monster. It is paganism, chaos, the devil himself. The saint conquers not for treasure or glory, but to bring order and salvation. This version became so popular that it spread across Europe, appearing in stained glass, manuscripts, and statues. The knight versus the dragon became a symbol of Christian triumph. But beneath it, you can still see older echoes. The serpent as chaos, the maiden as sacrifice, the hero as protector. It is the ancient pattern, rewritten for the medieval world. The Middle Ages gave dragons a new home: banners, shields, and coats of arms. In heraldry, the dragon was both fearsome and noble, a creature that spoke of power, protection, and ferocity. There were distinctions. The wyvern, a dragon with only 2 legs and wings, became common in English and French heraldry. Wyverns were seen as emblems of strength, endurance, and military might. The full 4-legged dragon appeared too, though less frequently, often symbolizing valor and guardianship. In Wales, the red dragon was carried as a symbol of resistance and sovereignty, drawing on the old Celtic legends. It endured through centuries and still waves on the Welsh flag today. Dragons also appeared in architecture, carved into cathedrals, crouching on rooftops, or spouting water as gargoyles. They guarded sacred spaces, not unlike the Nagas of Asia. In manuscripts, they wound through the borders, coiling between lines of illuminated text. The dragon, once an enemy of saints, became at the same time a mark of identity and protection. To wear a dragon on your shield was to say you had the power of fire and claw on your side. Not all medieval dragons were external foes. Some lived inside the imagination, representing the hidden forces of nature. In the secretive writings of alchemy, the dragon became a symbol of transformation. One image, above all others, endured: the Ouroboros, the serpent or dragon eating its own tail. It was drawn in circles, scales glimmering, jaws locked forever on its own body. This was not a monster. It was eternity, the cycle of destruction and renewal, the unity of opposites. Other alchemical texts spoke of the Draco Alchemicus, the inner dragon of base matter. To slay or tame it was to refine the self, to transform lead into gold, mortal into immortal. The dragon was the fire that devoured, but also the fire that purified. In this world of symbols, dragons were no longer simply beasts of flesh. They were metaphors for the forces that bind the cosmos, chaos and harmony, life and death, spirit and matter. Medieval mystics did not just fear dragons, they sought their meaning. Beyond saints and scholars, dragons roared across the folk tales of Europe. In Slavic lands, the zmei was a fearsome creature, often with multiple heads. Each head, when cut off, might grow back. Zmeis demanded tribute, carried off maidens, and were battled by bold heroes like Dobrynya Nikitich. Some were clever, able to speak, bargaining with humans rather than simply devouring them. In Germanic tales, dragons often guarded treasure, much like Fafnir before them. They lurked in caves, poisoning the land around them. Heroes such as Siegfried or Dietrich von Bern faced them, earning glory but often doom as well. In the British Isles, stories told of worms that plagued villages. The Lambton worm, for example, a serpent raised accidentally by a reckless youth, which grew in a moss and terrorized the countryside until finally slain. These worms were often wingless, more serpent than bat-like dragon, but no less terrifying. What unites all these European dragons is their connection to greed, destruction, and the corruption of the land. They were not cosmic gods, nor symbols of balance. They were pests on a terrible scale, embodying the dangers of unchecked hunger and pride. As Europe shifted into the Renaissance, dragons began to change again. They became less symbols of faith and more subjects of curiosity. Artists painted them into vast canvases, coiling in dramatic battles. Scholars debated their origins. Were they remnants of the great beasts of Genesis, or allegories for human vices? In bestiaries, dragons were described alongside lions and eagles, given traits that reflected moral lessons. Some texts claimed they were real animals, living in the deserts of Africa or the mountains of India. Reports of crocodiles and large snakes fed these beliefs, blurring natural history with legend. But in literature, dragons remained potent. Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen describes a vast dragon as the embodiment of evil, fought by the Red Cross Knight in a battle that spans days. Here, the dragon is not just an obstacle, but a stage for virtue itself. Renaissance thinkers inherited the old stories, but reinterpreted them. The dragon became a canvas onto which fears, virtues, and cosmic struggles could be painted. And though science would later sweep many of these creatures into the realm of myth, the image of the dragon only grew stronger. In China, the dragon, Long or Lung, was not a monster to be slain, but a symbol of power, prosperity, and cosmic order. Its story stretches back over 7,000 years, carved into jade and painted on pottery from Neolithic times. Always long-bodied, always serpentine, the Chinese dragon flowed through art, myth, and daily life. The dragon was not bound to fire. Instead, it was tied to water, to rivers, seas, and the storms that rolled across the land. To call upon the dragon was to ask for rain to nourish the crops. Temples rose in their honor. Rituals were performed to appease them. Farmers prayed for the dragon's favor, for a season without drought or flood. Dragons also stood for imperial authority. The emperor himself was called the son of the dragon, his throne the dragon throne. Imperial robes bore dragon motifs, coiling across silk in golden threads. To see the dragon was to see the very embodiment of the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. But Chinese dragons were not simply benevolent. They could be wrathful, punishing arrogance with storms and floods. Their power was not tame, but balanced, life-giving and life-taking, order and destruction bound together. Where Western stories made dragons the enemy, China made them ancestors, protectors, and rulers. To face one was not to slay it, but to honor it. To live in harmony with the dragon was to live in harmony with the cosmos itself. From China, the dragon traveled into Korea, where it became the Yong. Korean dragons share much with their Chinese cousins. Long, serpentine bodies, antler-like horns, clawed feet, and whiskered faces. They too were connected to water and weather, bringing rain to the land. But Korean dragons carried a softer reputation. They were seen as protectors, guardians of rivers and mountains. Some lived in palaces beneath lakes, emerging to aid those in need. Others were tied to the Emuji, giant serpent-like creatures who, after living for 1,000 years, could transform into full dragons. This idea of transformation set Korean dragons apart. The Emuji was not yet divine, but it aspired to become so. In some stories, humans could help or hinder this transformation. In others, the Emuji's rise to dragonhood was inevitable, a natural progression of time and power. Here, the dragon was a symbol of growth, of striving for higher forms. It reflected not only nature's cycles, but the human journey. The belief that even something humble could, through endurance, become something great. Traveling further south, dragons appear as nagas in the mythologies of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and beyond. These nagas were serpent dragons of rivers, lakes, and seas. In Buddhist and Hindu traditions, they were revered as guardians. Temples often depict them carved along stairways, their scaled bodies coiling upward to protect sacred spaces. To climb into a temple, past the Naga's fanged mouth, was to step symbolically into protection, leaving the profane world behind. In Thailand and Laos, the Mekong River itself is said to be guarded by great Nagas. Each year, mysterious fireballs rise from the river's surface, known as the Naga fireballs. Locals believe these are the breath of the dragons, rising into the night. Nagas were sometimes enemies of gods, sometimes their allies, but always they were powerful, otherworldly, and deeply tied to the rhythms of water and fertility. To live along their rivers was to live under their gaze. At this point, the contrast becomes clear. In the West, dragons were chaos to be conquered, greed to be punished, monsters to be slain. They represented corruption, destruction, and the dangers that lurked in wild places. In the East, dragons were ordered to be honored, blessings to be sought, guardians to be revered. They embodied harmony, prosperity, and the cycles of nature. One breathed fire, the other summoned rain. One hoarded gold, the other gifted harvests. One was slain by knights, the other crowned emperors. And yet, despite these differences, both share the same core. Humanity looking at forces beyond itself, chaos, nature, the unknown, and giving them shape in scales and claws. Dragons, east or west, are how we imagine the immensity of what we cannot control. One of the earliest great works of English literature ends with a dragon. Beowulf, the Old English epic, begins with heroes and monsters, but it closes with age, fate, and fire. In his youth, Beowulf slays Grendel and Grendel's mother, but in his old age, as king, he faces something different. A dragon awakened by greed. A thief has stolen a single cup from its hoard, and in fury the dragon unleashes its fire upon the land. Beowulf, now an old man, knows his duty. With only a few loyal warriors, he marches to the dragon's barrow. The beast emerges, scales glimmering, fire searing the night. Most of his companions flee, but one, Wiglaf, remains. Together, the two men strike the creature down. Yet in the battle, Beowulf is mortally wounded. He dies, leaving behind his people and the memory of his deeds. The dragon here is more than a monster. It is fate itself, the inevitable fire at the end of life. Beowulf's death is not failure. It is the price of greatness, the final duty of a king. In this story, the dragon is the end we cannot avoid, the shadow that comes for all. Centuries later, the dragon reappeared in the hands of J.R.R. Tolkien, who drew deeply on Beowulf for inspiration. His Smaug, in The Hobbit, is perhaps the most famous dragon of modern literature. Smaug is the archetype of the greedy dragon. He hoards gold and jewels in the halls of Erebor, lying atop the treasure like a living mountain. He is cunning, arrogant, and sly, his speech as sharp as his claws. When Bilbo Baggins comes to steal from him, Smaug toys with the Hobbit, sensing his presence even in invisibility. Tolkien gave Smaug more than fire and wings. He gave him personality, pride, intelligence, and a dangerous charm. When Smaug finally rises in wrath, he burns the town of Lake Town, scattering fire across the water, before being slain by Bard's black arrow. Smaug cemented the modern fantasy dragon. Winged, fire-breathing, greedy, intelligent, and terrible. He became the model for countless dragons in books, films, and games that followed. Not all dragons of literature came from epic poems or novels. Many came through fairy tales, whispered to children by firelight, or written down in the collections of folklorists. In Slavic tales, the Zmei often had multiple heads, each one spitting fire. Heroes such as Ivan Tsarevich or Dobrynya Nikitich rode out to fight them, their battles lasting days. Sometimes the Zmei could speak, making bargains or taunts, but always they stood as obstacles between the hero and his destiny. In Western fairy tales, dragons often guarded princesses, waiting for a hero to slay them and win the maiden's hand. The story of Sleeping Beauty, in its later versions, sometimes ended with the wicked fairy transforming into a dragon, slain by the prince. These dragons were less about cosmic balance and more about danger neatly packaged for a hero's triumph. The fairy tale dragon was simplified, a fire-breathing beast, a clear enemy, a final trial before the happy ending. Yet folklore was not always so simple. In many places, dragons were villains and protectors both, depending on the telling. In some Russian stories, the Zmei was not a beast at all, but a shape-shifting sorcerer, luring women away. In Balkan tales, dragons could protect villages, battling storms or rival monsters to keep the land safe. In the Alps, legends told of Tatzelwurms, short, serpent-bodied dragons with cat-like faces, haunting mountainsides. They were feared, but also served as warnings to respect the wild places of the world. Even within the same culture, the dragon could change roles. Sometimes a bringer of ruin, sometimes a guardian of treasure or land. Always dangerous, always powerful, but never entirely predictable. By the 18th and 19th centuries, dragons had begun to soften. Once enemies of saints and kings, they slipped into children's stories. Writers like Andrew Lang and the brothers Grimm collected fairy tales that often included dragons, but in retellings, they grew less terrifying. They became puzzles for heroes to solve, creatures to outwit as much as to slay. By the Victorian era, dragons could even be friendly. Kenneth Graham's The Reluctant Dragon, published in 1898, tells of a gentle dragon who prefers poetry to battle. The hero does not kill him, but befriends him, turning the old trope on its head. In this shift, we see how dragons moved from the terrifying to the whimsical, from cosmic foes to bedtime companions. The fire dimmed, but the scales remained. By the 19th century, dragons had slipped comfortably into Western literature, not only as fairy tale beasts, but as subjects of curiosity, allegory, and fantasy. Naturalists speculated about their origins, linking them to crocodiles, giant snakes, or even fossilized dinosaur bones. In this sense, science, often unknowingly, fed the myth. Writers reimagined dragons in new ways. In William Morris's The Story of the Glittering Plain and other early fantasies, dragons reappeared as symbols of greed and danger. But it was in the early 20th century that the dragon truly surged back into popular imagination. E. Nesbit's children's books featured playful dragons, while Edith Nesbit's The Book of Dragons gave them unique quirks, some comical, some terrifying. Meanwhile, G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald reworked the dragon as a test of faith and courage, blending Christian imagery with fairy tale wonder. The stage was being set for Tolkien, and with him, the dragon would become central to fantasy once again. When cinema arrived, dragons followed. Early films often depicted them with crude effects, stop-motion models, or puppets swaying stiffly across the screen. But even so, the image endured. Wings, scales, fire. In the 1950s and 60s, films like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Sleeping Beauty brought dragons to life with new visual flair. Maleficent's dragon form in Disney's Sleeping Beauty set the standard for a generation. Sleek, fire-breathing, horned, and winged. By the 1980s, fantasy films leaned into the spectacle. Dragon Slayer gave us Vermithrax Pejorative, one of the most terrifying dragons ever depicted on film. Dark, smoke-shrouded, with wings like torn sails. Vermithrax was no comic creature. She was ancient, primal, and monstrous. In the decades that followed, dragons grew only larger. They filled screens in Reign of Fire, in How to Train Your Dragon, and later in The Hobbit and Game of Thrones. Each one built on the old archetype but added its own twist, some terrifying, some friendly, some almost human in personality. Cinema gave dragons scale. It let us see them not just in words, but in motion, filling the skies. Two franchises in particular defined dragons for a new century: Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the Triwizard Tournament pitted Harry against a Hungarian horntail. Spiked, fire-breathing, and vicious, it was the pure embodiment of the Western dragon. Later, dragons appeared as powerful but controllable creatures, still dangerous, but not mindless. Then came Game of Thrones. Daenerys Targaryen's three dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, were not symbols or metaphors. They were weapons. They grew from hatchlings to engines of war, raining fire across armies, cities, and thrones. Yet they also bonded with their rider, reflecting loyalty, grief, and fury. They felt real, living, unpredictable. Through these series, dragons became mainstream again, not just for children or fantasy enthusiasts, but for millions worldwide. They were no longer distant myths. They were part of the cultural conversation. Outside the West, dragons continued to thrive in global pop culture. In Japan, anime and manga filled with dragons of all shapes. Allies, villains, gods, or even comic companions. Series like Dragon Ball reimagined Shenron as a wish-granting dragon, while Spirited Away gave us Haku, the river spirit who shifts between dragon and boy. In video games, dragons became bosses, companions, and world shapers. From Smorg-like monsters in Skyrim, to elegant Eastern dragons in Final Fantasy, to the iconic dragon-type Pokémon, they became some of the most beloved and feared creatures in gaming. In tabletop role-playing, especially Dungeons and Dragons, the dragon became central. Red dragons embodied greed and destruction. Gold dragons symbolized wisdom and justice. Entire campaigns could revolve around slaying or negotiating with these colossal beings. Here, dragons were no longer just monsters, they were personalities, ancient powers with motives of their own. The diversity of modern dragons reflects the diversity of storytelling itself. Some breathe fire, some grant wishes, some guard treasure, some are treasure. The possibilities are endless. After thousands of years, why do dragons remain? Why do they appear everywhere? From Mesopotamian clay tablets to CGI blockbusters, from children's books to epic sagas. Perhaps because they are the perfect mirror. They embody fear of chaos, of nature, of death. But they also embody longing, power, wisdom, transcendence. Dragons are both the nightmare in the cave and the dream of flight. In every culture, they shapeshift to fit the stories people need. In the West, they guard hoards of gold, reminding us of greed and mortality. In the East, they bring rain and fortune, teaching harmony with nature. In modern stories, they can be friends, foes, or something in between. Dragons endure because they are not just monsters. They are the canvas upon which humanity paints its greatest struggles and its wildest hopes. And so, when we dream of dragons, we dream of ourselves, our fears, our desires, our endless imagination, all bound in scale and flame. And that brings us to the close of tonight's journey. From Tiamat in the rivers of Mesopotamia, to Smorg coiled upon gold, to dragons flying once more across our screens, the story stretches without end. The dragon has always been with us, and it seems it always will be. Until then, rest well, traveler. The fire burns low, and the shelves wait patiently for your return.